We're going to be talking about three different subjects. Part one is uh, uh, a, a version of a presentation I recently did. We're going to talk primarily about what's going on in the world during this 2025 period of let's call it dynamic trade policy adjustments. I'll get into some of the detail there. And then I'm going to go into some of the emerging, I think, not only high performance, but rapidly getting traction technology, some of the only new technologies to really hit the industry in quite a while. And then those will be very focused on the Windows side of the world, which is the only thing I know anything about. And then I'm going to do something that's new, that's fun, and I've really enjoyed putting together a handful of slides that talks about Pennsylvania and what I see from my perspective of the unusually influential and from my perspective, well-deserved um, 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 influence that Pennsylvania has on the national discussion in both the existing legacy energy industry plus how it's melding into the new energy climate. We'll get to that in a minute, but I think it's fascinating and probably almost more apparent to me. I have the Steelers and Eagles in there. I have to admit I was born and raised in Cleveland and grew up hating the Steelers, but as an aged American, I've now learned to appreciate excellent football, sustained excellence. So kudos where that deserves to rest. It's been interesting times for sure for those of us that have sort of survived the last 4 or 5 years, from the beginning of the pandemic to one of the first true European wars in recent history to what has been some would say tumultuous start to the year from a political perspective. It's been very interesting. I grew up in college studying both history and political science, and I've been fascinated watching the national election and national discourse. And deeply interested in sort of Pennsylvania's what I'd call a very important role in shaping national politics. Let's jump into international trade. You have to be really living under a rock to not understand how unusual it's been for the last 6 to 9 months relative to our federal trade policy. But I wanted to try to stop and analyze what does that all mean as we've kind of gotten past a lot of the back and forth, or we think we've gotten past a lot of the back and forth and things have settled in relative to the passive building market. And I'm using that as a proxy for what I would call high performance windows, because I think whether one realizes it or not, from my perspective, I think the passive building movement has really gained what I think is the forefront of the national discourse on how to define high performance. So I've studied it a lot, and being the first U.S. manufacturer to provide data in the format that was necessary for passive house software to have its right inputs on center of glass, edge of glass, frame. Way back in 2009, I've been a student of what's gone on with both, the broad, what I would call passive house movement. We've attended conferences for many, many years now. And it's not unusual for us to be the only U.S. manufacturer of Windows at the conference. In fact, just prior to the pandemic, I went to a conference just outside of New York, and we counted 27 different companies selling Windows. We were one of two US-based companies at that time. So it's been the source of, obviously pretty dynamic import activity. And I track kind of this information, and this is pretty different. I want to kind of suggest on the FIAS side, not so much on the PHI side. FIAS, I think, has continued to modify some of the um, ability to list windows, whether they qualify sort of under more strict interpretations of high performance windows or not. They've really intentionally tried to create more opportunities for US based manufacturers to provide certified data so that they can be considered in projects that may or may not be wanting to achieve certified product data or maybe in more cooling dominated climates. And it's made a difference. I think we've seen a significant increase in the number of companies in the United States that have understood now added verified data with different levels of being able to participate in higher performance products. Not so much with the PHI side of life. Why has it taken so long for U.S. manufacturers, particularly, to adapt to what I think is an important, clear macro trend? I think fundamentally, and I've studied this for a long time, fundamentally, window designs in the U.S. are different. They're not worse, they're not better, they're just different. There's a much higher percentage of windows that have non-hinged operation. I think two-thirds of windows manufactured in the US are still sliding horizontal or vertical operations that tend to have narrower glass pockets. And I think under the PHI sort of more strict definitions of high performance windows have been, somewhat penalized for typically having smaller frames and lower performing frames. That has been confusing for the U.S. window industry, generally speaking, not so much for us, but for others. And I think it's led them to not really pay attention to trying to figure out how to adapt their designs. And what it's done is it's allowed a massive amount of import traffic to hit the United States. I've been tracking it since for more than a decade carefully. I think I might be the only one in the US that does it, but it's been fascinating for me because we've watched imports grow with little or no resistance from mainstream, what I call US manufacturers. I want to talk a little about trade patterns. We're going to talk in sort of macro numbers. I'm going to try not to read this, but I want to really point out the highlights. I've been tracking import activity into the United States once again for literally 12 years, I think now. And it has followed a steady, nonstop beat of up in windows and doors. I've tracked it from country to country. I've tried to understand the patterns, understand why, and try to use it to predict what's going on. And it has not slowed. But what we are seeing is some real patterns emerge. PVC windows, typically with tilt and turn in swing capabilities that have been designed into major metropolitan areas in mass to create designed far larger operating windows than can be accommodated with most US outswing operations, have really grown to dominate certain markets, I think, and are still very much on the front line of others. Our company offers both a North American style passive qualified product and a European style. We've done that since 2015, largely in response to this phenomena. They're both very high performance. We both focus very heavily on what we think is a competitive advantage in glass, but it has not stopped an onslaught of continued a wave of imports that continue to come into the United States. The PVC window side of it is really grown to largely emerge out of two countries for the most part. I keep tracking other countries, Turkey and some others, Romania, et cetera, that seem to pop up from time to time. But Poland and Lithuania have really kind of dominated that activity, and it's really from a handful of companies, to be frank. Aluminum has been kind of a bit of a hidden product, and I think, as you will see in my discussions here in a moment, I think it's going to be less so shortly. But I think higher performance window frames with European design, not all these are, high performance, but certainly a disproportionate amount have really been also flooding the United States from different countries as well. All of this is against a backdrop that has been fascinating to me. I watch and I listen actively, just more as a political science student, to discussions on trade deficits and all that kind of thing. But I think it's been, and maybe I'm just not loud enough, but It's been fascinating to me that U.S. exports have actually declined in the same time period so dramatically to a paltry $18 million. And I think, frankly, most of that is one company in the U.S. shipping to its parent company back in Europe. Early on, people said, oh, it's just all currency, currency, currency. It's just, there's such an advantage for imports, but that hasn't really been the case for quite a few years now. I think you'll see the currency has been pretty stable since 2015, while imports continue to grow pretty straight line up. Um, Canada, a bit of a different story, I think. This is a trading partner. It's been in the news a lot lately. I frankly have been to Canada 5 times in the last 90 to 120 days. There's a lot of interest in high performance products and glass in Canada, as you might imagine. But we have seen a steady increase in imports in some categories, but overall, it has really not been overwhelming. Some of this data includes steel. We've seen a lot more high-end steel products, stainless steel and rolled steel coming out of Europe recently in some markets, mostly the luxury residential market. But when you remove steel and you really focus on the two categories that I think are the most influential, PVC and aluminum, you see a pretty similar story over a period of time, but it clearly has slowed. And there's a tremendous amount of active trade back and forth between US and Canada that when you net it all out, doesn't really show the same sort of growing trade imbalance. The Canadian dollar really had a pretty dramatic steep decline back in the 2012 to 2014 timeframe. We buy products out of fiberglass products out of Canada, and we sort of watch this in real time. But much like the euro, it's been pretty stable for a long period of time. Let's talk about China. Why do we care about China? I'll tell you in a moment. I've never really paid attention to China. They're obviously in the news, trade is in the news, but there has been, as I understood and kind of delved deeper into it, a pretty significant growth in what I would call lower end commodity oriented products coming out of China, flooding primarily the West Coast and really causing a lot of pain and suffering for companies that have U.S. manufacturers that have really lined up to be in that particular supply relationship with their customers where they've seen quite a bit of disruption. And I think we'll see. It really doesn't impact us on the high performance side. I frankly have never seen a Chinese product in a high performance product, but I think it has had some impact, and I think it could have some residual impact I'll talk about in a moment as well. Another country that I've read about just because we do a lot of work with commercial aluminum residential or commercial aluminum frame companies, and there's a handful of publicly traded companies that I pay attention to. And there's been a lot of, let's just call it sort of a lot of people pointing at low cost imports coming out of Colombia. And why is that? This is a pretty dramatic slice of imports, and it's the function of a very similar free trade agreement that was negotiated with Colombia, similar to what the was referred to as NAFTA, now the USMCA, between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, that allowed for trade to take place between Colombia and the U.S., and it really manifested itself in dramatic increase in exports from one company in particular into the United States. I think this has been really under the radar, but it's an important kind of bellwether of what I think is going to get ready to happen. It's not all about windows. We want to talk about glass. This has been kind of interesting. Just kind of a fact nerd here, but I'm not quite sure I fully understand where this is all going or why it's going or why these numbers are what they are. But for years in discussions with domestic insulated glass manufacturers, they simply have not seen a dramatic increase in the demand for triple pane. And I've oftentimes thought to myself, that's because you're not even in the discussion. And it's been a bit of a hidden market, in my opinion. This is not a huge amount of numbers, but it's been also pretty steadily increasing for a long period of time in multi-chamber insulated glass units coming into the United States. I'm presuming there's no way of really verifying the data, at least that I've had the patience to get into, that a lot of these are triple pane units. A lot of them may be wider triple pane units, more akin to what's produced more dynamically and normally in Europe than may be available in the United States readily. But I don't really know what's behind this. But it's a fairly significant increase in activity. I mean, it's been pretty steady. Um, in Canada, once again, there's so much export activity from glass and glass units going back and forth across the border. I think Cardinal has a big facility in northern in Fargo, North Dakota, that supplies a lot of products into Canada, and no doubt there's others, that it has been pretty much a net neutral event out of Canada, not so out of Europe. What about glass in Asia? This is really probably under the radar, but and certainly was for me until I started studying it. We don't buy glass from Asia, but there has been a huge amount of activity in recent years to penalize putting massive penalties on Chinese suppliers. And it doesn't go against the country, it goes on individual suppliers accused of sort of unfair trade practices. In this case, it covers virtually all of the biggest flat glass producers, these 246% dumping penalties that recently went in, but almost as immediately as they are put in place, workouts emerge where product that was coming out of China is now diverted to coming out of Malaysia and Vietnam, sometimes with Chinese owned factories. But the most interesting data is, notwithstanding these dumping penalties, look at the year to date imports. Should have a million after the Chinese number, but the pace, and I've been tracking the pace of imports. The pace through the first half of the year was dramatically accelerated. It'll be fascinating to see if that was just trying to beat tariffs or if it's sort of a steady thing. I've got a line on that in a little bit that I'll cover because I just updated some of this data out of Europe this morning. But it's a highly functional situation, and now there's a lot of activity trying to identify the workaround solutions to penalize them. But it's a bit of whack-a-mole here. Who cares about Asia and glass? What does that have to do with us? Well, the reality of it is, if there are significant disruptions in supply channel, I don't frankly know who buys this or, what the implications are. But what I do know is that flat glass in the United States in particular is really dominated by only a handful of companies. Cardinal, Guardian, Vitro have a massive, massive, very mature stranglehold on the most of the flat glass supply. Pilkington, NSG, and Saint Gobain out of Mexico are other participants in the in this category, but it's a pretty full, mature supply channel. Anytime there's major disruptions in supply from imports, I spent 12 years in the flat glass or flat steel, both stainless, aluminum, and carbon steel markets, and we experienced a lot of this with a lot of the same sort of very mature supply networks. Any disruption in import can have a pretty dramatic impact on U.S. prices. There is very little idled capacity in the steel business. Sometimes people would take down furnaces to reline them for years, but it really was just to manage capacity. That doesn't really exist in glass. You don't shut a primary glass factory and then bring it back up. And adding capacity just is pretty difficult. They're very, very energy intensive. There's a lot of dramatic permitting and competitive demand for electricity with data centers competing at this point. That makes it pretty difficult. So glass pricing could be very volatile. I just wanted to point out that quick note at the bottom. This was interesting that a colleague that is much more in touch with what's going on in Europe sent me a newsletter where they're saying that because, and I'm assuming this is because of those massive capacity or countervailing duties that the US put on China. Now Europe is raising the alarm that they're seeing this massive wave of imports from China coming in and destabilizing their pricing. I thought that was ironic. What are the implications? I think when you add everything up and you go back, a decade. We've seen almost $1 billion of what I would call trade deficit growth between Europe and Canada in broad window categories. Not all of it is high performance. There's no way to really know what percentage of it is high performance. I've recently been able to track one particular country, and I matched that up with the revenues of one company that's shipping from one country, and it confirms what I've suspected, that the vast majority of these imports are not what I would call low-end, non-high performance products. The vast majority of them, I think, have had a really strong correlation with the rise of the passive building movement more generally across the country. I think it's been a far more important driver of underlying activity. We sell a lot of product that is not just going into passive house, passive building certified products, but going into what I would call passive building design inspired. In the residential side, far more going into what I would call passive building design inspired than certified products. And I think because of that, it's been a bit of a hidden category for and difficult to measure. It's a much more actionable on the commercial side where it's frequently tied to tax credits, et cetera. But I think the influence of the passive building movement has been immense, and largely, once again, completely underestimated by many US companies who can't understand it, track it, and measure it. And it's really created this exceptional high amount of imports. Tariffs will apply to all products. I think I've already seen some pretty anecdotal evidence that a lot of importers have simply shoved the tariffs up the supply chain and really aren't that badly impacted. Some of the recent import data would sort of confirm that. I think aluminum is a different story. I think aluminum is going to suffer a little bit more of a tariff imposition, from what I can tell, that will have a bigger impact on imports of aluminum products where they've got kind of their own special status here. And certainly Asia, I think, is likely to experience some bigger influence, bigger tariffs that is yet to be kind of fully baked into sort of what's going to happen. I think US and USMCA compliant Canadian manufacturers, which is virtually most of them that have been doing business, are not going to be anywhere nearly as much impacted, but most companies have some components that are sourced internationally. And if you are bringing products in, there will be some upward price pressure, no doubt about it. I think that keep an eye on aluminum. I think aluminum could be significantly impacted, and keep a really close eye on glass prices. This is sort of one of the few broader slides. I think this is what, as I sit, put my feet up on the table, and I think about what has happened here, we have certainly seen, everybody has seen lots of confusion, delays, projects put on hold, awaiting clarity. Clearly, there's a bit more of the fog clearing about where things are going. And I think a lot of projects are coming back on. I've seen a lot delayed, some canceled, a lot now that are in hurry up go mode. There's been a fair amount of, just in conversations with other window companies, sort of generally what I consider to be back, people trying to understand positioning. What does it mean for them? And I'm not sure. And then there's been a fair amount of people that just don't really care. They're full speed ahead and almost ignoring any of this trade policy nonsense. We have seen a dramatic increase in from the design community and trying to understand the nature of our supply sources. Do we qualify for BABA? Where is our product coming from? Being a US manufacturer in the space has been interesting. We kind of assumed everybody knew that we were US, but I think it's almost like, what are you really? Because there's so many companies that really aren't US based that make the appearance of being US based. I think some of the longer term implications could be capital investment. I think with the uncertainty, capital needs a longer term, more certain future. I think there's expectations that political forces will ebb and flow and will go up and down. And I think there's probably a little bit of pullback on broadly on capital investment. I can't really tell. It's hard for me to get my eyes on that, but significant upward price pressure without a doubt. And I think some what we're seeing resets of supply chains to be more thoughtful about um, where the products are going. We saw imports in the first half of the year rise sharply when you annualize them, divide by, in the first 6 months, divide by six, multiply by 12. Clearly, there was a wave of import traffic trying to beat tariffs, and there's an expectation that they'll decline sharply in the second half of the year. I just updated for this presentation some of the more micro data on a country by country, product by product data through August. Frankly, September should be out now. I assume it's not out because of the government shutdown, but I do have information that's 2 months older than when I first put this presentation together. And it's been interesting. I have seen what I would call a pretty wide disparity of reactions. I've seen a couple of countries and a couple of what I would call major categories of import traffic that have had absolutely no downward shift in imports. In fact, they've increased up in July and August from what was really heavy supply earlier than that. I've seen countries that have had pretty dramatic declines in import traffic. So it's a little confusing, but it's all over the board for what it's worth. A quick mention here, the Chinese symbol for the word danger, or for the word crisis, is made up of two symbols that collectively uh, reference individually as danger and opportunity. And I think that's the word that I would say it's certainly not a crisis, but there is both opportunity and danger. I'm going to quickly hit this area because I want to get to the innovation part of it and make sure I keep space here. I'm going to talk about innovation in the window and glass technology. The point here is this is the market adoption of float glass technology. It was invented in 1959 by the Pilkington brothers. It took 10 years for it to become the dominant process by which float glass. It had a dramatic impact on two really critical areas of manufacturing that we take for granted today, which is double pane windows, which were originally patented back in the Civil War, but went through dramatic market adoption as a direct result of float glass, lowering price, increasing size and quality. And right behind that was the adoption of low E glass, which really started in the latter part of the century and went through a rapid market adoption. I think we all understand that. I have been laboring under the assumption that for the longest time, for many, many decades, that Canada and Europe have all been making triple pane glass, and it's just the way it is, etc. And it was surprising to me, frankly, as I researched it to understand that that's not really the case. In fact, triple pane was pretty rare until about this 2005 timeframe, and it occurred and it went through rapid market adoption for reasons that I won't get into because I don't have time today, but essentially because one company said this passive house thing is going to be big. Let's start optimizing our production for triple pane rather than double pane and drop prices. And that's what caused not only that to scale up in Europe, but it caused the same equipment manufacturers to come to Canada and create the same outcome in Canada. When you look at those innovations, each one of them reflected a common trend toward a growing market need, a new approach from a technical perspective, and each case, one company started out and was rapidly followed by others. So I want to talk about some of the new technologies in light of innovation fitting growing needs. Once again, going back, growing market need identified, the innovation must be appropriate. This is an interesting design, but I think relevant, and I'll talk about it briefly. U.S. windows, typically consumer preferences for U.S. windows are very different, much less frame area, lighter weight, narrower IG pockets, and there's been a ton of what I would call, particularly early on, really, really large, oversized European import products, beautiful products, etc. But I think there's been some lash back at the size and operation in some applications of European windows that have trade-offs. Having said that, U.S. window design is not going to change and suddenly become big, massive European window designs or overnight tilt and turns. It is what it is. And I think what's important about emerging technologies, both thin glass, triples, aerogel's a little bit further behind, and vacuum insulated glasses, they both fit in existing window designs. Thin glass, we're one of a number of companies that are working with thin glass. We're proud to have been kind of the leading innovator, bringing it online in our own company in 2019, and it's going extremely well and receiving a tremendous market adoption as we've gone through it. And we're going through a period of rapid commercialization. At the same time, Luxwall has done a really good job of introducing vacuum insulated glass again to the United States. It started with Guardian years ago, who went through a period of market adoption with vacuum insulated glass, lost patience and shut it down. And I think some of those same principles are working with Luxwall. And we're big fans of anybody that's doing something different in the US. And I think what they're doing is really interesting. There are two different technologies. Vacuum insulated glass has been around for many, many years. And I think it's gone through periods of improvement. Thin glass used in other applications has also been around for a long time, used in architectural applications. I think we're the original movers there, and it was really made possible by the much larger sizes of flat screen TVs, creating what I would call viable architectural sizes to work with. I think they're both very impactful technologies. Once again, vacuum insulated glass is largely commercialized in China. That's where vast majority of production has occurred, and Luxwell is the first U.S. manufacturer. A second company recently announced plans to build vacuum insulated glass in the United States. We'll see how that takes place. Thin glass, large size, once again made possible by flat screen TVs, not iPhones, has really created some of the market options that make it appropriate for use in architectural application. And I might note there's been quite a bit of activity lately by some of the what I call leading IG makers in Europe that are now introducing thin glass into their products. So what's we're it's one of the only times where I've seen Europe actually follow a U.S. company. But I think it's going to have a very big footprint. Both solutions fit North American styles. That's why I think they have good chances of being successful. This is an interesting slide I'm going to spend just a moment on, but it's a comparison of vacuum insulated glass, talks about center of glass being really, really high. We don't really care about that. We care about whole window performance. That's really been kind of the what we like to nerd out about. And it's surprising to some that when you take into account the edge of glass uh, element of uh, vacuum insulated glass, that it really levels the playing ground. In fact, we like our chances in the high performance space of creating what I call are much more commercially viable solutions overall. Um, Going back to May You Live in Interesting Times, this is a second quote I stole. I'm not Chinese. I like to thrive in interesting times. Um, Let me talk about Pennsylvania. I only got a handful of slides here, but they're really fun. Once again, I grew up in Ohio. I love Pennsylvania. And the Midwest. I think it has a lot of things to be proud of. But I think Pennsylvania really is a unique place in the world from what I can tell as a student of history and having spent 12 years in metal distribution. I've always appreciated Pennsylvania as a U.S. Steel and kind of their long tradition of steel mills, some of which survive, some of which haven't, being really born and bred in Pennsylvania. Um, as most everybody knows that lives in Pennsylvania, I think Pennsylvania is a longtime leading mining center, and steel production center is sort of well universally known. I did not know, although heard it on TikTok of all places, probably 6 months ago, and then followed it up here, that the very first sort of modern oil drilling operation took place in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania really was an innovator of what I call the modern petroleum oil industry, for lack of a better phrase. Even less well known than that, although maybe generally understood, is that almost a third of the glass fabrication in the entire country took place, not just in Pennsylvania, but took place in Allegheny County, which is where I think PPG grew up, etc. These are photos of what glass making used to look like just prior to the invention of the float process. And you can imagine it's pretty dramatic changes in technology that took place. But uh, the point is, Pennsylvania has always been a real center of the universe in glass manufacturing. I mentioned earlier the Pilkington brothers of the United Kingdom developed the float process. They actually brought it to life in the 50s and introduced it to the world in 1959. But it was PPG that really became the clear world leader in the commercialization as they understood that. And the Pilkington brothers licensed the technology to become fully converted to float glass technology. Part of that graph I showed earlier, which was a massively fast adoption of float glass, which really transformed the whole industry. It's still the primary glass manufacturing method used today. Um, this is what's going on in Vandergrift, Pennsylvania, in Westmoreland County, right next to Allegheny. This is a image of the line that Alpen is proudly in bringing up and bringing on to production as we speak. You see a small photo of thin glass produced by Corning, which is done unlike the float process and what they call a vertical fusion method, which is pretty remarkable. But this is really a state-of-the-art line for thin glass production. We have one in Colorado. We're anxious for this one to get up in the Pittsburgh area, and it's coming online as we speak and producing glass. It's a pretty remarkable line, and the only one of its ilk from that producer that can produce thin glass quads, which we think are going to be an extremely important part of not only US high performance windows, but I think the uh, uh, same products in Europe and other countries that can afford to have wider pockets. It's been a remarkable product. Pennsylvania, this is another wonderful project out in Muhlenberg that we were lucky enough to be involved in recently, and it came open in 2023. It just finished its first full year of actual energy production. And what we love about Passive House and Passive House design is that it works. We know it works. Sometimes LEED certification has wonderful, certificates, etc., but sometimes the results are a little bit short of expectations. We know that Passive House, by principle, has to go through a validation and verification process, and I think that's why it's been so important. We put bird glass in. We've done about 10 or 12 bird glass jobs, and that's also a whole specialty area that we love to see exploding across the world. It's growing dramatically. It'll be a $3.5 billion glass industry from nothing, really, only a handful of years ago worldwide. The inventor, original mover of the bird-friendly glazing movement is from that college, and that's why this building has bird-friendly glass in it. I first went out and looked at it, and I could not understand why they were doing bird glass in this fairly low-rise commercial building, and understood it's because this fairly famous professor was there. But it has also achieved multiple certification, was the first living building change core certified deep green building as well. A beautiful building. And then what I'd like to really kind of trumpet, and I know you're aware of this. I think you're aware of this, but I don't. I have this unique perspective of watching different things flow across the country. We're deeply involved in Passive House. This is a really, really, really significant thing that happened in 2015. And it was, from what I can understand, kind of the product of um, some of the early movers in the Passive House movement, including Tim McDonald and Onion Flats, and no doubt others that were able to include only 10 points of qualification credit in the low income federal tax credit competitive application process for Passive House design that triggered 8 buildings being approved. I don't know how many were built out of that 8. I just don't have that data. But what we saw from 2015, and we were lucky enough to have our windows and what as at least we have been told and seems to be shown as the first multifamily passive house project built under this program, and just outside of Pittsburgh, called Uptown Lofts. The first of, I don't know, I think it was maybe 48 units, and I think we've last count maybe done 20,000, 30,000 units at this point. It has gone from Pennsylvania, and we saw it roll across the United States in over and over and over again into what I would call affordable housing projects. And out of that passive house inspired design that was critical, what we've seen now is sort of a pile-on effect that I can only attribute back to this original mover, and that is over and over again, out of that affordable housing and tax credit financed movement, we've seen it move into what I would call more direct mainstream multifamily building. And we can see a direct connection between what happened in Pittsburgh as it flowed into Connecticut, as it then flowed into Massachusetts very, very quickly to be used to create early prototype projects that were designed to passive house standards that were then used as proof of two critical points to allow that policy to move forward in what I call mainstream. One was that the incremental cost to passive house build uh, projects is not remotely close to the hysteria some of the mainstream trade associations would lead us to believe, but in fact, very, very minor incremental cost. And most importantly, and I think most influentially, and really, really, I think creating tremendous momentum, that the actual results that were modeled actually work. And I think that's been the really biggest overall mover of why Passive House as a design methodology has really moved into what I think is the clear prime position, and why other sort of building house standards like LEED, which is, I'm not criticizing it, that were criticized early for not necessarily having even and consistent performance as a result of their, I think it's why it's made its difference. As everybody knows, I think here, Massachusetts adopted in their specialized stretch energy code passive house as a requirement for multifamily projects over 12,000 square feet in size. And that's been fairly revolutionary as their a quote unquote experiment triggered by some of these early sort of opportunities to study its impact has had a pretty profound impact in rolling across the country in many, many ways. It's really hard to fully understand, but it really allowed me to see the Keystone State for what it was. I think it's really played as it has many times, a sort of a critical role in early following Pennsylvania. I think I hope you fully appreciate the political status that you have as a quote unquote swing state, but also as a uniquely what I'd call multi-voiced state with what I think is recognized as a pretty moderate to even conservative element of the population to, on the eastern side, a more urban area, but really a very, very critical kind of voice as a state. Tremendous innovator, tremendous baseline as an industrial powerhouse. I think that foothold in both traditional energy sources and this important voice in the new energy economy, I think are a really great asset for Pennsylvania. So thank you for your contributions as a state. Keep them coming. I think you're sort of that Midwestern modesty that is not necessarily everywhere in the world, but I think Pennsylvania really deserves a special nod for what it's done.